Today's story is called The Precious Stove. It's a folk tale from Austria. Peter lived with his mother, father, brothers, and sisters in an old wooden cottage deep in the woods of Austria. They were very poor, and the cottage had hardly any furniture, and they might have been very cold in winter, were it not for their most treasured possession, a stove. This was no ordinary stove. It was made of white porcelain, and it was so tall the gold crown at the top almost scraped the ceiling. Its feet were carved like lion's claws, the talons painted like gold. The sides of the stove were painted with flowers and rare birds in glowing colors, and the door was tiled in blue and gold. It looked very out of place in the poor wooden cottage, for it had originally been made for a king's palace. Many years before, Peter's grandfather had rescued it, after a great war, from the ruins of the palace where he used to work. Peter used to draw copies of the flowers and birds on pieces of brown paper with a stub of an old pencil. One evening, as Peter and his sister Gilda lay curled up in the warmth at the foot of the stove, their father came in, shaking the snow from his boots. Let me see the stove. He looked tired and ill. "My children, tomorrow the stove will be taken away, as I've had to sell it. We have no money, and we need more food than we need a stove. And we need food more than we need a stove." The children were horrified, but their father would not change his mind. That night, instead of banking up the stove to keep it burning warmly through the night, he let the fire die down so it was quite cold in the morning. The traders arrived and loaded the stove onto a cart. Peter's mother and father looked at the handful of gold coins the traders had given them and shook their heads. Peter and Gilda whispered together outside behind the woodpile. "You have to follow the cart, Peter," said Gilda, "so you can see where our stove goes." So Peter rushed off down the track after the cart, pausing only to grab a couple of apples. The journey into town was slow, but by evening it had reached the station. Peter crept as close as he dared, and heard the traders arranging for the stove to go to Vienna by train the very next morning. Once the traders had gone to an inn for the night, he clambered inside the stove. He soon fell fast asleep. When he awoke, the train was moving fast. Peter munched his apples and wondered what his parents would be thinking. Just where was he going to end up, and what could he do to keep the stove for his family? Eventually the train came to a halt, and with much banging and clattering, all the boxes around the stove were unloaded onto the platform. Then Peter heard a gruff voice. "That valuable stove is going to the palace. Take care it isn't damaged in any way." The palace? Peter sat as quiet as a mouse as he felt the stove lifted onto another cart. It clattered through cobbled streets and then came to a halt. "Truly, it is a very beautiful stove. I did not expect it to be so fine," said a deep, important voice. And then the handle of the door turned, and light flooded into the stove. Peter tumbled out onto the floor. Before looking up at a man dressed in a bright red jacket, with great gold tassels and gold buttons, glittering metals gleamed on his chest, and a great silver sword hung by his side. It was the king. Peter was absolutely terrified, but the king kept on smiling. "Well, my boy, how did you come to be inside my new stove?" A servant rushed forward and grabbed Peter by the arm, meaning to drag him away, but the king raised his hand and the man stepped back. "Let the child speak," said the king. Well, once Peter found his tongue, he could not stop. He told the king all about the stove. The king listened in silence while Peter told his story. "Peter, I'm going to give you back your stove, I'm not going to give you back your stove, for it belongs here in the palace. But I will give your father several bags of gold, for it is a very valuable stove. And perhaps you would like to stay here and look after it for me?" he asked. Peter was delighted. He looked after the stove for the king from that day on. His family never wanted for food again, and every summer they would all come to stay at the palace to see Peter, and the stove, of course.